Dancing Bears, Painted Wings, by Lovesbitca8. Summary. Hermione stared at him, and in a flash something blurred in front of her eyes, some refraction of the light like a prism of color splashing over him. She remembered him from school so clearly for a moment, as if he had ever swept his arm around and allowed her to walk in front of him anywhere. It felt like another life, a different universe of events. Granger! She blinked and it vanished. Malfoy was frowning at her. There was something wrong with her tree. Hermione tilted her head, examining the branches and ornaments. She didn't know what it was, but something was missing. It bothered her all afternoon. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something she'd forgotten. It had her mother's ornament, the tinsel she hated to clean up, but which her father always insisted on, her favorite twinkling lights, and a star on top. It was a perfectly perfect tree, and she wondered why she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Harry and Ginny didn't put up their tree until Christmas Eve, which she thought was a waste of a wonderful month. She didn't know what Ron did with his tree. It had been years since they'd lived together, and they hadn't shared a Christmas on the same lease. But at 29, Hermione had been living alone for several years now, and one of the perks was that she could do what she liked with her Christmas decorations. She always tried to bring as much of her childhood into Christmas as she could, seeing as her parents were still lost to her in Australia. She'd gone to find them after the war, of course, peering in on them in their candy shop. She'd found a lovely couple who couldn't complain of a single thing. The mind healers she'd been to see had let her know what a terrible process it would be to restore their minds. If she'd only erased their memories of her, the healers could possibly reinstate them, but Hermione had manufactured new memories, enriching their pasts without her in it. With 2 lives in their head, it would be a grueling process with a low chance of success. But they told her not to give up hope, that memories can return on their own, especially if the spellcaster was inconsistent or not strong at memory charms. Hermione had smiled weakly and thanked them, but she knew that wouldn't be the case. Her confidence in her own abilities told her that her parents wouldn't wake up one day and wonder what it was they'd lost, flipping open her book to where she'd last left it. But after only a page, her eyes dragged back to the tree. There was definitely something wrong. Scanning for curses, jinxes, or even something stuck in the branches, she exhausted herself trying to figure it out. She went to bed that evening with a splitting headache, pinning for the Sunday afternoon she'd lost while trying to figure it out. A week later, the tree mystery still wasn't solved, and Hermione began to avoid her living room altogether. It brought her no joy to be near the tree. It was almost like rereading a book she thought she'd loved, only to find it bland. In fact, there were several novels she'd had to give away simply because they pestered her to even exist on her shelves. Revisiting them after 10 years proved them lacking in some way, and she could never quite recall who had recommended them to her in the first place. It wasn't all Christmas trees that bothered her, she realized. She was perfectly happy to enjoy the decorations solely brought in over the month of December at work. There was no confusion or befuddlement when the wreaths and garlands were strung throughout the corridors of level 4 of the ministry. The only strange thing that began happening was the smell. It wasn't a terrible smell by any measure. It was actually quite pleasant, as if some wintry afternoon had slipped in through the vents and enchanted her senses. She was in the crowded lifts on a Monday morning, trying to place the scent, when the doors clunked open and Harry squeezed in. He spotted her head in the bag and gave her a smile. Just as she began to smile back, he said, "Malfoy," in greeting. Hermione craned her neck around the tall man in front of her, and sure enough, there was Draco Malfoy leaning against the corner of the box. Harry asked him about a project he'd brought to Malfoy and the curse-breaking team last week, and Hermione pressed her lips together. Malfoy had been working for the ministry for about 5 years already, but Hermione didn't think she'd ever get used to Harry's casual regard for him. They were friends, possibly, definitely amiable co-workers, if anything about Draco Malfoy could be called amiable. She supposed that since his father had been kissed and his mother had gotten ill and died shortly after, Malfoy wasn't all that bad anymore. Losing both parents tends to change a person. When the lift doors opened to the atrium, everyone piled out, except Malfoy. Hermione, who had been tucked in the back corner, was the last to exit, and her curiosity won out. "Headed down to the Wizengamot?" she asked. He lifted a brow at her, and it lacked the disdain the movement had contained in the past. "No." He held his hand out as the doors tried to close, and swept his arm towards her. "Ladies first." Hermione stared at him, and in a flash something blurred in front of her eyes. Some refraction of the light, like a prism of colour splashing over him. She remembered him from school so clearly for a moment, as if he had ever swept his arm out and allowed her to walk in front of him anywhere. It felt like another life, a different universe of events. "Granger?" She blinked and had vanished. Malfoy was frowning at her, and Hermione scampered out of the lift before she had to explain the strange thing that just occurred. Hermione put the incident out of her mind for a week. She'd been tired that day, and her brain did odd things when overworked. On the Saturday 2 weeks before Christmas, she dragged Ginny into Diagon Alley with her for some last-minute shopping. "You know, Hermione," she said, "it doesn't count as last minute if you're doing it 2 weeks in advance." "You must be joking. This is the latest I've ever shopped for Harry and Ron." Hermione brushed her hair out of her face and tugged Ginny past the storefront. "I'm only glad I've got yours wrapped up already." "Glad to hear it," Ginny said, then stopped and pointed to the store Hermione was walking past. "And here, they have great things for blokes." Hermione blinked at the yellow and purple front. She hadn't been inside for several years now, but something about the shopkeeper made her uncomfortable. The tall blonde woman who owned the shop was perfectly nice, but Hermione always felt uneasy, as if she could be hexed at any moment. It wasn't rational, but it was a gut instinct that she'd learned to trust. No, not there." She flashed Ginny a smile and tucked her into a shop full of trinkets. As she browsed, she couldn't find anything for Harry or Ron that was thoughtful or needed. She met Ginny over by the tree, full of ornaments for sale, and sighed wearily. "There's nothing here. I suppose I need your assistance in the Quidditch store, don't I?" "Thought you'd never ask," Ginny said brightly. She turned towards the exit, eager to leave. Hermione began to follow when her eyes caught on an ornament off to the side. It was an otter figurine made of gold and strung from the tree by a red ribbon. She tried to tear her gaze from it, but was unable to. Something about it was familiar. "Hermione!" Ginny called from the door. She ignored her, reaching for the ornament. The rational part of her mind wondered if she was entranced, if perhaps the object was cursed. But when her fingers touched it, the same prism of colours burst behind her eyes. The otter dangled from long pale fingers. It was a wispy silver that matched his eyes. Hermione squeezed her eyelids shut. When she opened them, the otter was still gold, hanging from the tree in the shop. "Hermione!" Ginny said firmly. Hermione startled and found Ginny standing next to her, her gaze flicking between her and the ornament, almost suspiciously. "Is everything all right?" Her voice was tight. "Yes," Hermione cleared her throat. "This ornament is just so familiar." She puckered it off the tree, but nothing flashed across her vision this time. Moving toward the register, she smiled at the shopkeeper and said, "You happen to have this in silver, almost a Patronus-like style?" "Miss Granger," he said warmly. The shopkeeper took the ornament from her with feeble fingers and looked it over. "Ah, there was a series of ornaments like this in silver, if memory serves. But that was years ago, possibly a decade." "A decade?" Hermione blinked at the gold otter in his hands. It wasn't quite right, but she supposed it would do. Maybe this would finally make her tree feel complete. "Well, I'll take this one." Once she'd paid and thanked the shopkeeper, she turned to Ginny, fussing with her gloves. "Ready to go?" Ginny asked. Hermione nodded, tucking her package into her robes. "Onwards!" The Ministry's holiday party was an affair to remember. Every year the atrium was enlarged to hold all employees and their guests. Hermione quite appreciated the newly sprouted alcoves and pockets of conversation that could be found when one didn't want to be out in the open. What she didn't appreciate was the mistletoe. "Horribly outdated tradition," she grumbled to Ginny as one bounced closer to them. "You know, they encourage casual sexual misconduct." "Yes, we know," said Ginny. Personally, it's the most action I've had in weeks." "What?" said Harry as he appeared on her other side. "Never mind, dear," Ginny said lightly, looping her arm through his and patting his elbow. "You've been buried at work, I know." What?" Harry repeated. Hermione, whose eyes was on the mistletoe, moved to the other side of Harry to escape it. The result was the mistletoe landing on her two married friends, who happily kissed. There were throngs of people eager to speak to Harry and Hermione, the heads of the Auror Office and the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, respectively, and plenty who wanted to talk Harpy's defense with Ginny. In fact, after an hour, there was quite a crowd around the three of them. Hermione found that she missed Ron in these situations. Ever since he left the Auror program, he had missed every ministry holiday party, too swamped at the joke shop. Rationally, Hermione knew they were better as friends, but it was times like these that she missed his easy manners and flowing conversations. When they had been together, she'd always known there was something missing, some spark or secret held like a precious thing. And even when she dated after him, she couldn't quite find what she was looking for. She always told herself she'd know it when she found it, but she still didn't know what the it was. Hermione was deep in conversation with a woman she believed to be an unspeakable, but of course she couldn't just ask, so she missed the moment entirely when Draco Malfoy began speaking with Harry. One moment she was seconds away from concluding her unspeakable investigation, and the next her focus was snatched by the sound of a throaty laugh. Her head snapped to the left, and there, hardly a step away, Draco Malfoy was chuckling at something Harry said. There were lines around his eyes that only appeared when he smiled, which explained why Hermione had never seen them before, and his teeth glinted like a wolf's in the twilight, a predatory intensity that should have frightened her, but instead spoke to something else, something missing. His lips wrapped carefully around his glass of fire whiskey, and his throat moved sinuously as he swallowed. She saw herself under him suddenly, as if a daydream had sprouted unwanted into her mind. Sunlight across soft sheets, her mouth nipping his throat as his hips ground against hers, fingertips dancing along her hip and ribs as he breathed harshly into her neck, whispering delicious, filthy things about her body. "Miss Granger?" Heat flooded Hermione's face as she realized she'd not only zoned out on her conversation, but also Draco Malfoy was staring back at her. She tore her gaze away and smiled brightly at the woman whose name she'd already forgotten. "Right, sorry. Say it again." Fanning herself despite the chill in the atrium, she started cataloguing her symptoms as the unspeakable continued, because clearly she was quite ill. A fully formed sexual fantasy in the middle of a work party about Draco Malfoy. Perhaps it was time for St. Mungo's. She was torn from her thoughts by a terrible thing. "Oi!" one of her co-workers said, pointing. "Mistletoe time!" Hermione looked up, and there, like the harbinger of the apocalypse, was a mistletoe bouncing above herself and Draco Malfoy. Her heart thudded in her chest as her eyes met Malfoy's. His face was a cool mask, neither excited nor repulsed, so Hermione supposed she could feel the same and just forget that exquisite sexual encounter she'd fabricated in her own mind just seconds ago. "You know," Ginny said suddenly, "we should really do away with this. It promotes casual sexual misconduct." "Shut up, Potter," a large woman said, elbowing her way to the front with hungry excitement in her eyes. Was that popcorn she was eating? In fact, it seemed all of Hermione's co-workers had their attention fixed on them, like a pack of hyenas ready to be entertained. When she considered it, Malfoy had less of a dating life than even she had. A few beautiful purebloods in his early 20s, but after that, a muggle girl for only a few weeks. She supposed he was just as married to his work as she was. Fine, Hermione thought. Get it over with. She stepped up to Draco Malfoy and rose on her toes. He pressed a light hand to her hip, and she shivered as he inclined his mouth towards hers. When their lips touched, she expected something. She wasn't quite sure what. Perhaps another flood of color and strange visions. Maybe a quick re-entrance into the sexual fantasy from moments ago, preferably picking up where it left off. But nothing happened, aside from a delightful kiss to her surprise. His lips were warm and pliant, and her body leaned to be closer. It was over in maybe a second. Not quite a peck, but not much more than that. She lowered down to her heels and hid her flushing face. Clearing her throat, she said, "Now, to no one in particular." Hermione excused herself to get another glass of champagne. Any reason to leave the centre of the attention just then, but she glanced at Malfoy quickly before leaving. He was still looking at her, almost as if he couldn't believe that they'd kissed. But there was something else there, under that shock. Some familiar intensity. Now, there were two problems to solve: her Christmas tree and Draco Malfoy. In the final days leading up to Christmas, she found herself dreaming about him vividly. The night of the ministry party, to both her mortification and delight, her dreams had picked up right where her fantasy had left off. Malfoy had grunted in her ear as he thrust into her, and Hermione had keened deliciously as their bodies slipped against each other. She had no context for the dream, only that they were wound around each other in bed, having woken up on a sleepy morning. Malfoy had made her come twice before finally finding his own release. When Hermione had woken up to the reality, she had the faintest memory of a whispered, "I love you," in her ear. As disturbing and exhilarating as it was, Hermione tried to put it out of her head as she readied herself for work. But as luck would have it, she ended up sharing a lift with Malfoy twice. He looked terrible, with dark circles like he hadn't slept. She supposed it was better that he wasn't dreaming like she was, but then again, he stared at her differently that day, as if he had something to say but didn't quite know how to ask it. That night, a completely different dream took hold of her. Hogwarts was still burning in the distance, but Hermione had slipped away from Harry and Ron. It was the morning of the final battle, and they lost so many, but she was determined to get to the edge of the Forbidden Forest. From behind a tree, Draco Malfoy stepped out, and they stared at each other. After a moment, he finally asked, "Are you all right?" She'd felt her throat tighten, and she nodded. He moved carefully toward her, searching her face for any hesitation, and then brought her into his arms and pressed his face to her neck. "I'm so sorry, Granger. I'm so sorry." "You did the best you could. We all did," Hermione had said, and then she'd pulled his lips to hers and kissed him for the first time in over a year. She clutched him to her, his scent enveloping her senses, wintry and crisp. When Hermione had woken from that dream, she'd stared at the ceiling, waiting for her mind to rationalize. It haunted her all day, like another life. She'd seen Malfoy only once that day, moving quickly in the opposite direction. She packed her bags quickly, sticking her notes and spare quills in at odd angles, rushing for the door. Draco was just exiting the classroom, and Hermione flushed bright red as their eyes met. "Ladies first," he said cordially, but the smirk on his lips betrayed him. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from beaming at him, and stepped past his swept-out arm. Just as she passed the threshold, his hand cupped her bum and gave it a squeeze. She squealed and spun around. "Not here!" His eyes were fond, and his smile was lecherous. Hermione bolted up in bed. Blinking in the darkness of Ginny's room in the burrow, she tried to catch her breath. She ran her hand over her face, trying to remember where she was and why. It was Christmas Eve, well now Christmas morning, and she was staying at the burrow for the holiday tomorrow. Dreams of Malfoy had continued all week, but now, after this dream in McGonagall's classroom, she was sure there was something going on. Hermione quietly dressed, determined to see the one person who could explain it. She crept down the stairs and had just slipped on her coat when a creak on the landing stopped her. Ginny was peering down at her in the darkness. "Hermione?" "I'll be right back. I have something I need to do." "You're going to see Malfoy, aren't you?" Her blood stopped dead in her veins. Hermione stared at her friend's silhouette in the darkness, and suspicion crept in. "How would you have guessed that?" Ginny ran a hand through her hair in a nervous gesture, and looked up the stairs for eavesdroppers before wrapping her robe tightly and crossing to Hermione. "I need you to know," she began, and Hermione felt herself hang like a spider in the air. "I need you to know that I didn't understand it until it was too late." "Understand what?" "And that I would have fixed it for you if I could have." "Understand what, Ginny?" Ginny swallowed, and Hermione felt her heart pounding. "I think you know. I think something's been happening to you, and it has to do with Malfoy." Hermione nodded. "I've been having these flashes, these dreams." "Memories?" It was as if a clock that had been inching towards midnight had finally struck. Like cocks turning, like a stubborn puzzle piece sliding into place. Hermione felt her buzzing skin go still. "Did you tamper with my memories, Ginny?" "Of course not, Hermione. It wasn't me," she replied calmly. "But I suspected you were seeing Draco Malfoy for some time since your 6th year, and then one day something changed in you. I thought he'd broken your heart or that you'd gone your separate ways, but it was different than that. It was as if a part of you had disappeared." Air rattled out of Hermione's lungs as she tried to grasp onto something. "When?" "Around Christmas time after the war." "That's 10 years ago, Ginny." Hermione's voice rang out, bouncing through the barrel. "How could you let 10 years go by without telling me this?" "I told you I didn't understand it until it was too late. It wasn't until 2 years later that I realized it." Ginny sobbed, pressing her fingers to her mouth. "I asked you. I said, did you ever fancy Malfoy at school? And you were so disgusted with me, Hermione. It wasn't a fear of being caught. It was absolute ignorance to the truth." Hermione had only the slightest memory of this. Ginny's coy smile. "Hermione, you can tell me." "And I knew," Ginny continued, pressing the tears away. "I knew that it had been true. Well, you were with Ron by then, and everything seemed as it should be." "What do you mean, you knew?" "The bloody otter ornament. I'd seen him buy it for you, and I'd seen it on your tree." Hermione spun and sprinted out the door. She ran to the edge of the burrow and apparated to the gates of Malfoy Manor. She couldn't think. She just needed to see him. The sun was rising over the property as she raced down the lane. She thought of her parents as she ran. Tears dripped down her cheeks at the idea that she had done this to them. That there was a part of them that would never be complete, no matter how happy they were in Australia. Because now it was clear as bell, the piece of her, the feeling of loss in the mornings, the lackluster romances, the loneliness she felt when surrounded by people. That piece of her had been taken. Taking the steps 2 at a time, Hermione pounded on the front door. It swung open, and Malfoy stared at her like she was a ghost. Just seeing him was enough. It had to be true. The angles of his face, the way his lips parted, the eyelashes she could count. And had, years ago. She didn't know what to say, how to ask it, but then he just said, "Are you having dreams as well?" Her face crumpled, and she burst into tears. When he pulled her into his chest, she fit there like a glove. They spent hours sitting in a remodeled drawing room, sharing each of their newly remembered memories. Draco told her how he dreamt earlier that week about their first kiss, after a potions project in the library, and she told him about finding him after the Battle of Hogwarts. They pieced it together, getting closer and closer to the truth. Hermione was busied by the signs of it, the facts, the timeline. She didn't allow herself to ruminate on the emotional toll of it until she had answers. They sat on the sofa, a Christmas tree behind them, and they talked well into the morning. Her eyes caught on something silver on the tree. She abruptly stopped, freezing. The silver otter. "Now you remember this ornament?" she said, standing swiftly and taking it from the tree. "No, I found it in a box of Mother's old Christmas things several years ago." She turned to him. "You gave it to me, over a decade ago." Her fingers ran over the sleek figurine, and something that had been out of place since she'd put up her Christmas tree slotted into position. "How did it end up here, I wonder?" "I think I know how we lost our memories," he admitted, while she was running her fingers over the ornament. Her eyes snapped to him. "I had a dream, a memory, of bringing you to meet Mother the year after the war." Hermione swallowed. "We came out to your mother." She could tell it had been serious just from her own memories, but that was an awful lot. She returned to the sofa, ornament in one hand, and Draco reached out to take her other. "I think we were going to tell everyone, and our first stop was my mother. She was sick, and we didn't want it to be a shock to her." "You think it was her?" Hermione asked softly. "It would make sense," he said, sadness in his eyes. "It would have gone against everything she stood for, everything my father stood for, and with her being so ill, it would make sense that the magic didn't hold." "It held for 10 years, Hermione reminded him, "until about a month ago." Tentatively, he raised his hand to brush a curl out of her face. "I didn't remember anything until the mistletoe." "You didn't?" He shook his head. "I've been dreaming of you, off and on for several years, but that was nothing new." Her lashes fluttered and her heart pounded. "It wasn't?" "No, I've been dreaming of you since our school days." His eyes were soft, and then he winked and smirked at her. "You're always so saucy in my dreams, and eager to please." That's how you can tell it's a dream, I suppose," she teased. "I also," Draco said, eyes flicking down to their hands, "I also had plenty of dreams implying how intimate we were." "Oh," she squeaked, I hadn't had any of those." "Really? We only held hands in your memories, Granger." He rubbed his thumb over her palm, and she felt her skin ignite. She said. "Those must have been your saucy, eager-to-please dreams coming back to you." His body leaned closer, his hand cupped her jaw. "Must be." When their lips touched this time, she saw endless universes of the two of them. Every kiss, every smile, every time he'd made her laugh. She resolved in that very moment to see the mind healers again. Parents deserved this absolute bliss and surety that you were on the correct path, that the world was set at rights. She opened her mouth to him and let his lips remind her of everything she didn't know she'd lost. The end. Thank you for listening to Dancing Bears Painted Wings by Lovesbitca8. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, AO3, or Tumblr.